Hi guys. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been thinking about inking. And I've been trying to process this stuff mentally for the last 72 hours or so because I've just been thinking really hard about it and trying to articulate it in a way that makes sense. So when you talk about inking a drawing, I think that it's important to make a distinction between the approaches that you would use when you're inking a drawing that's a realistic style drawing and when you're inking a cartoon. And inking traditional comics, like let's say Marvel Comics, exists somewhere in a gradient between realistic type inking and really, really cartoony inking. And most of the rules that you end up reading about inking apply mostly to realistic inking. And when you go toward the cartoony side of the spectrum, a lot of those rules start to break down. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. So this is a cartoon by T.S. Sullivan, and even though it's a cartoon and that it's exaggerated and there's a rhino with a nice hat, the draftsmanship is somewhat realistic in nature in that there is a lot of hatching, there's a lot of texture employed, the proportions are exaggerated, but if the proportions weren't exaggerated, there's a lot about this drawing that would appear very realistic. Like the texture of the rhino's skin has been pretty lovingly rendered, the hair on his face has been described, and the if you can see my cursor here, you've got a light source coming from behind the rhino, it's illuminating his back, and then he's casting a shadow. You have this ape over here, and his features are exaggerated, but otherwise the style of draftsmanship is very realistic. Like, for example, this tree is a very realistic tree. It's not exaggerated at all. So here's, even though it's a cartoon, it's not an exaggerated type of draftsmanship. It's a realistic style of draftsmanship, and as a result, some of the common rules of inking apply here. And what are those rules? Well, usually they are that you want to put a heavier line weight on things that are closer to make them pop forward. You want to put a heavier line weight around things that are under, like the undersides of, here's a foot, and the underside of the foot has a heavy line compared to, say, the top of the rhino's butt over here with a light striking it. You want to have this heavy line, which almost implies a shadow. And you want to have a heavy line to emphasize more important bodily forms compared to less important bodily forms. So the back of the rhino is very heavy, the shoulder line is very heavy compared to, let's say, the tail over here. This is a smaller feature, and so you don't have as heavy a line around the tail as you do on the back of the spine. You can see that because this foot is closer to the viewer, it's encapsulated by a relatively heavy line. The horn is a little bit farther away compared to the foot, so the horn doesn't have a very heavy line around it. It has and has a relatively, actually it's subtle, but if you can see it, there's a lighter outline toward the light source than away from the light source, because the part away from the light source is in shadow, so the outline is a little bit heavier. And you can also see that over here on the ape, that there's a slightly lighter line on the top of the hat than on the underside, because the underside is in shadow. So even though this is a cartoon, it still obeys some pretty realistic rules about inking. I'm going to show you a couple of other drawings here which I think show some of those rules again. The next few I'm going to show you are by Frank Frazetta, who did plenty of realistic pen and ink work, and he also did things that are really cartoony, like funny animal comics. So this is a Frazetta drawing, if it is real and not a copy. You can see some of these things, like this leg is pushing forward, so you have a very heavy line in the area where the foot is crossing in front of the back leg, you have this heavy dark line here which helps bring this leg forward. It's effective at showing the fact that this is in front of this. And likewise up here in these horns you have a heavier line under the horn than on top. Those are just a few of these things, and here's another thing here. Part of this is because the hand has a face that's partly in shadow, but there's the overall effect is that the handle of the axe and the overall underside of the hand have a heavier outline because they're passing in front of the body. And that's one of the things that helps give the illusion of depth. Here's another Frazetta drawing. It's kind of difficult to see, and the lines are so light that it's a little bit harder to see the distinction or the contrast, but there's very, very, very thin lines in the background, somewhat thicker lines in the foreground, but here you can see even better. The top of his calf, the outline is so thin that he either didn't even draw it at some places, or it was so thin that it got missed in whatever scanning process was used. But the underside of the calf that's in shadow has this chunky, heavy outline. Same thing over here. You've got a really, really thin top line for the boot, and it gets thicker and thicker as you go into shadow. And finally you've got this heavy, it's not that heavy, but it's a thicker outline for this guy's hand because it's closer to the viewer compared to, let's say, her face even, or her hand, or any of these lines over here. They're very thin. This one is a little bit thicker by comparison. Here's another Frazetta drawing. We're getting closer to the comic universe, but again, the draftsmanship is still pretty realistic. So you've got heavier lines for things that are in shadow. You've got, here is a great example of this guy's face down here. You've got a heavy line under his chin and in his collar because he's closer to the camera than this guy. Same thing over here. This guy's holding a bag. The outline of the bag is very heavy because it's coming forward. Again, same stuff. Very, very heavy outlines over here, or underlines. Heavy outline around the arm because the arm is forward compared to this guy's face, which is a little bit further back. I'm sorry to be repeating this so frequently, but it's good to see multiple examples of it. This hand has a very heavy line compared to this guy's whole body. This hand is close to the camera, and these people are far away. Alright, now things start to get a little different. This is also by Frazetta. A lot of people don't know that before he ever did fantasy drawings of people with axes and naked ladies and dragons, that he did funny animal comics. So I'm sorry that it's half-tone and a little bit hard to see, but if you start looking at these style of comics, I love these comics. I like these. I like Carl Barks. I like old Disney comics, Asterix. I like things that are in that sort of Disney-ish style. They're very cartoony. And when you start to get to the cartoon universe, the rules of inking break down. They no longer do what you would expect them to do. So, for example, there are some instances where, yes, you do see heavier lines in things that are closer or bigger. Like here's this pig and his face is closer, and so you see this very heavy outline under part of his snout and part of his chin. But you also see heavy outlines in other places that you wouldn't necessarily see them in realistic drawing. And there's some other ones that show better examples of that. This is a Paul Terry, and here's a better example of this. The top of this foot has a heavier outline than the bottom, but the bottom of the leg has a heavier outline than the top of the leg. The top of the snout of the dog has a relatively heavy outline. It's not as heavy as what's down here. And he's theoretically closer to us than the lion, but the lion has a much heavier outline under a lot of its features, around a lot of its features. Even the hair of the lion is very heavy. And I'm not quite at a point where I can articulate why or what the theory behind putting heavy lines around some of these things is. It's not always that you put the heavy line around what's closer. And it's not always that you put the heavy line around what's under. It's not the same thing as what governs the inking on realistic drawings. It's just something different. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. Here's some more. This is another Frank Frazetta funny animal drawing. So there's a heavy line under the beak. That makes sense, sure. But there's also a heavy line, relatively speaking, on the top of the head. And you would think in theory that that was a place where there would be light coming down. Wouldn't you want heavy lines, underneath these feathers? But it isn't always what you find. Sometimes in these cartoon inking examples, here there's a heavier line on the top of his leg than on the bottom. Or you'll find a heavier line on the part of this chicken that's farther away than the face. The face is somewhat thinner, but the body is thicker. Same thing over here. Like the body has a thick line over here, and the face has a thinner line, but it doesn't really compromise the appearance of the depth. Or, for example, the foot of the duck over here has a very heavy outline. It's even heavier than the beak of this chicken, which is presumably coming right at us. But it doesn't make this chicken suddenly look far away. Somehow it works, but it works in spite of what would at first glance appear to be somewhat occasionally breaking the rules. Here, I think his name is Dan Yeeps. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation. He's Dutch. This is also a character by another Dutch artist named Harold Superman. This is a perfect example of a very Disney-ish approach to inking. I love this stuff, and if you try to do stuff like this in a conventional thought process about inking, where you always put the heavy line on the under thing, you always put the heavy line on the close thing, it's not going to work. And I know this from experience. Here's another situation where the underside of the beard is, it's pretty thick, but the outside here is even thicker. And you've got a place where the ear, which you would think would be a relatively insignificant part of the overall composition of the head, has a very thick outline, and so does the top of the back of the hair here, where you'd think that, okay, so here's the robe, and the robe is in light, so it's got a thin line here to suggest that it's not in shadow, but the hair here has a thick line. It's getting the same light. What gives? The crown has a heavy, heavy outline on the top and on the bottom. It doesn't make any sense. The top of the rim of the coffee mug that the duck is sitting in has a thin rim, but the top of the duck's head has a thick outline. Same thing over here. You've got, you've got the underside of the arm and it's heavy. Alright, that makes sense. But the top of the hand is also heavy. So some of these things make sense, and some of them don't. The things that are making these, that are determining the line weights for drawings that are like this are going to be different from things that are going to determine the line weights of a traditional drawing. So even if you're really, really good at inking a realistic drawing, it's not necessarily going to make you good at inking a cartoony drawing. So depending on what style you're going to do your comic in, you have to take into account these distinctions. And they might kind of surprise you. I found this out just by analyzing another Harold Superman drawing, and found that pretty much it didn't coincide with any of my expectations about where the heavy and thin lines would be. Here's another example where you've got this knife is coming forward, but it's thinner than something that's behind it. Okay, well, maybe the knife is thin and you want it to look sharp, and the body is, this guy's heavy, and you want it to look bigger, so you put a line under it. But then the top of this cloth garment is also thick. So I'm noticing this a lot. The more of these drawings I analyze, the more I discover that you want thick and thin lines in these cartoony style drawings, but they don't obey any of the rules that you would expect a normal drawing to obey based on what pretty much every textbook says about how you should ink, how you should think about inking. So don't assume that you're going to ink in a logical way. Analyze the style of whatever it is that you want your comic to look like, and check for yourself whether that comic is going to obey the traditional rules of inking or obey a little bit more graphical or stylized or almost symbolic approach to what the purpose of line weights are in that situation. And I hope that that is helpful. Please send me a message, leave a comment, send an email if that doesn't make any sense. And thanks again.